Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. I thought I would mix this one in here while I'm continuing to do the other popular close encounters videos. Thank you so much everyone for those views. A lot of people seem to like them, so I'm going to go ahead and definitely do some more soon. This one though has to do with a similar theme involving the disappearance of a man who many people believe also had the closest encounters of all with a UFO, in this case actually disappearing with one outright. And I'm going to talk about all the information leading up to that spectacular point and then showcase my own theories as to what happened to him and some of the other theories that people have mentioned as well. But definitely lots of unusual and interesting info associated with this guy. In fact, you're looking at a picture of him now. His name was Granger Taylor, and he was known as the man who disappeared with a UFO. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating information associated with this very, very strange encounter. So here's essentially what happened. Granger Taylor was someone that was born back on October 7th, 1948, there at a town called Duncan, there in British Columbia. So this was up in the northern parts of Canada. And as it turns out, at an early age, he had a tragedy. In this case, his biological father died right when he was an infant. And so what happened was he ended up moving into another family because his mother married a person by the name of Jim Taylor. And then he in turn was incorporated. In other words, Granger was incorporated into that other family, and in total, there were 7 siblings together. So definitely almost like a Brady Bunch of sorts. But yes, even from an early age, people noticed that Granger definitely stood out. He was considered withdrawn and socially awkward, but by the same token, he was absolutely just hungry for when it came to mechanics and when it came to learning things. In fact, there was this notion that even as a child in his bedroom, he was working with a bunch of the toys that he had in his room, taking them apart, putting them back together, trying to find out everything that made them work. And people considered him to be exceptionally bright when it came to that. Unfortunately, none of this really translated to his schoolwork, as he ended up actually dropping out in the 8th grade. But even then, this didn't sate anything in terms of his hunger for thinking and for tinkering on things, because shortly after that, he ended up working with his neighbor, an auto mechanic, who took him in and then was able to showcase as much as they could towards that type of work. And then sure enough, this guy Granger ended up using those type of skills to develop a huge amount of technology, nomanship when it comes to that. And so he ended up setting up his own shop at a very young age, and then he began to use this to work on projects. Some of these were mechanical projects. Others seemed to be what were considered unconventional stuff, meaning like he would just basically do things for collectors or in some cases for the government themselves. And it turns out he was making some pretty good money from it. So ever since being a child and working on those toys and then turning it into a lifelong passion, especially going there on his own, he was able to do something and turns it into a form of success. In fact, some of his most notable works were he was doing like a single cylinder automobile. He also rebuilt and abandoned a bulldozer from scratch, one that was previously considered just completely unsalvageable. And then one of his biggest works was he took a locomotive that was out there in the rainforest, just completely rusted over. It was almost as if the entire nature itself took over that locomotive. But no, it took him 2 years, but he was able to use his funds, his works, his knowledge, everything to turn it into a full working locomotive once again. And he even laid tracks for it, and he was able to have children go on rides for it altogether. All of this work, all of this unique stuff that he was doing made Granger a very popular, if you could call it, attraction around that area. People started to hear more about him, and then they were able to take other projects to him. And again, he was able to use this for his success and so on. This was probably around the late 1960s, to be specific, 69 or so. And then that's where things took a different turn in his life. It turns out in that area there, in that town, specifically New Year's Eve, 1969, that's where people started to see flying saucers going around the area. In fact, in a place that was a hospital called Cowichan District Hospital, nearby actually his home at the time, that's when at 5 in the morning, 4 nurses described seeing a brilliantly lit flying saucer hovering above their window. And even one of them stated that they saw these 2 humanoid pilots right by the area that would be considered the cockpit, and then they saw it just zoom away into the night, almost like a shooting star. And then throughout the following nights, more and more citizens around that town of Duncan saw these things too. So if you add those two together, there's a very good chance that it was around this point that Granger started to change his lifelong passion. It went from working on, let's say, collector's items, stuff from the government, reworkings of things that are considered unsalvageable. It seems like he in turn either A, saw a UFO, or B, heard too many people talking about it that he suddenly realized, what if I went on this path? He instantly developed an interest with regards to that. Part of this was also culminating into this other passion that he was having at the time towards working on aircraft. And so he thought to himself, why not work on the ultimate aircraft of sorts, and that is a flying saucer. He wanted to tackle that particular mystery, especially when it comes to the speed that UFOs move, the maneuverability of them, the overall just unique, obviously advanced technology tied to them. Here he was, someone that had a very strong mechanical mind, somebody that was able to do all these workings from just the barest of scratch elements. Here he was trying to see if he could do that and then create a real life flying saucer. And so eventually his next step was this. He decided to create his own private office, which was almost like a UFO of sorts. It wasn't really like the actual UFO that he would work on, but it was more of he wanted to construct something to do his thinking in. And so he was able to scavenge a whole bunch of parts from local dumps, and then he was creating a cylindrical building there, and he was eventually able to create this structure. And he was there inside it with a working stove, a couch, and television, and that's where he spent the next part of his life there, working on all these books, like trying to figure out what could he do when it comes to the engineering associated with UFOs. And people that were there that would come over would see all his books and his notes. They would see all of his work on propulsion systems. There he was, just essentially trying to figure out that mystery. Here's where things could have taken, though, a deeper, darker turn. Because if he was working on it, and let's say he got success for it, great, then that's something where he would in turn be able to use that into his next path. But if he was working on it and he just couldn't get that final part, that final answer that was needed, the one that was probably so close to him, but he just couldn't grasp it, one could imagine that it could be very frustrating for Granger. More on that here in a minute as to one of the other theories as to what happened to him. Either way, though, as it turns out, another pivotal point happened in his life while he was working on that UFO. He claims, and we know this because apparently he told this to a teenager at the time, a guy by the name of Robert Keller, who was there with him. Granger claims, that it was during this time period that he in turn began getting communication telepathically from some alien beings. They did so, I guess it was just solely through the mind, or who knows, maybe they paid him a visit in person, but they were stating that they were from beyond another solar system. They had apparently heard what he was working on, and so because of it, he stood out, and they were talking to him on that part with regards to his new pet project. And so he's claimed, Granger told him that he had several of these telepathic conversions. On one point, he was asking the aliens to just please give him that final answer, whatever he needed when it comes to the construction of a real UFO. What powers it? Closest that he said they would tell him was that it had to do with magnetism. But that was about it. They would not go any closer as to giving him the answer. And so finally he told him that at one point that, and this was, I don't know if his friend was truly believing him or not, he suspected that because of his genius that there could be a thing where it was something else happening within his mind, but he didn't want to necessarily tell him outright, hey, you're losing your mind, that kind of stuff. But still, he was able to hear this information. And then finally, Granger told him that at one point, these aliens were going to come and they were going to take him on an interstellar voyage. In fact, they wanted to do this at a particular date. It would have to be on a rainy night, a very stormy night, so that way the public would not see these aliens who wanted to remain hidden. And so later on, and this was the fateful night, everything that I just mentioned throughout this entire story, this was the leading point to it. It was November 29th, 1980. And that's when his disappearance occurred. Here's what happened. The storm of the century was what the newspapers later called it that night. There was a huge amount of rain, thunder, lightning, and winds. Trees were uprooted, and then there were power lines that were torn down. And right before that storm came, one of the last living witnesses to Granger Taylor saw him go to a place called Bob's Grill, which was one of his favorite restaurants. The waitress who was there at the time served him his meal and then saw there was nothing really unusual about him. He had his consistent clothes on him, which were of jeans, and then were also like a knitted sweater and so on. But what stood out was that he didn't have a coat with him. This was a place, obviously the surrounding area showed that it was about to rain, but it seemed like he was just there in his regular clothes, not anticipating it, which stood out. And so at about 6:30 that evening, Granger Taylor paid his bill. I guess paid it with the waitress. She was the last living witness, saw him leave the diner, and then drove off into the distance with his usual truck, which was a 1972 blue Datsun truck. He was never ever seen again. No one ever saw him at any point whatsoever in that town or anywhere else. Obviously, once his parents realized that he was gone, there was a search made for it. They found a note that was placed on his doorway. And as you can see, that's what it says here. Dear mother and father, I have gone away to walk aboard an alien ship. As recurring dreams assured, a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the vast universe and then return. I am leaving behind all my possessions to you, as I will no longer require the use of any. Please use the instructions in my will as a guide to help. And then he ended up by saying, love, Granger. There was some things that were there also as well, including a map that was drawn by him, and it showed an area by Waterloo Mountain, but it was presumed that this could have had something associated with him, but there was really much that was tied to it. And then there was a full-on search by authorities and others. They checked logging roads, they checked hospitals, they checked any of the known whereabouts associated with Granger, but no, nobody could ever find him. They actually looked at his will, and they noticed that he had crossed out the word deceased with the word departed, again indicating his belief that he was actually going to go into a UFO that night. And then that was it. He was gone. 42 months later, on the time period where he would have returned, that would have been June 29th, 1983. That's when his stepbrother was waiting for him, believing that maybe something truly could happen with regards to that return, especially since he was still gone at that point. And the belief was if he was on a UFO and they were following his guideline, then yeah, he would be back that night. But no, he never ever came back. And then as it turns out, one other bit of news that could be tied to him in 1986, so about 6 years after his disappearance, there was this artificial crater, like almost like a deepening of the ground, that was found in an area near Mount Prevost Road. And then that's where people saw it was like as if it was something had been blown up within that specific crater, if you could call it that. That's where there were remnants found of both a truck and then also two other types of shards of human bone. And they were actually scattered throughout the place. And so the leading theory on that, after some investigation by the police and then other members of the family and others, was that this was his final resting point. Somewhere along the way, and because he was someone that heavily dealt with dynamite when it came to his work, somewhere along the way, his truck was blown up in that vicinity, and he may have been within it, and those bones could have been tied to him. Unfortunately, there was very little DNA profiling at the time. I don't know where the DNA is now, by the way. That would be another thing to actually consider nowadays. But no, anything as far as that theory, that's at least from the police. So that's the only other link as to his disappearance, was this crater that could have been the final point of his life if there was truly an explosion that involved his truck and that involved him within it. But no, he either disappeared into the sky, never to be seen again with help of a UFO, or there was something else altogether. But yes, let's talk about those theories too. I just highlighted that one with regards to the crater associated with the truck and then the remains of his bones. There's that indication. It ties into two things there. One is that he accidentally blew himself up. He had his truck, he had his dynamite with the truck, and just by pure happen chance, pure accident, the truck or the dynamite was set off, and it ended up blowing him and the truck off. And obviously he was dead at that point. The other one ties into that darker theory that I was mentioning earlier, and that was the fact that if he was someone that was so obsessed with figuring out how the propulsions of a UFO work but just couldn't get it, there's a notion that he could have been driven insane from it. Like he didn't want to, he got so mad about this, so frustrated about this, that he didn't want to go on living at that point, and that he in turn committed suicide. This is where things get contested, obviously, by people that loved him, because they would state that no, he never would be someone that would be considering suicide. But there's that notion that I was mentioning earlier. The other theory is that he simply just disappeared, went off into the world someplace else, never to be seen again. Like he's out there in this world somewhere, obviously being 1980 and then now 2022, 40 years later, he could still be alive, but just under a different guise, a different pseudonym, and so on. I think this could also be the case because I've talked about that within some of my other videos in the past, how people just disappear. And then when that happens, they're still around. They just don't want to be found again. And then the other theory is that, hey, he actually did go with a UFO. That would be just 100% though belief, because there is no proof associated with it. Nothing in terms of a flying saucer that was seen within those vicinities, and obviously, taking him and going somewhere. It remains to be seen if he's going to come back, if that occurs, because another theory is that time, and maybe in the world of UFOs and the aliens linked to them, is different. So 42 months could be stretched out towards a much longer period than it would be here in our time. And so maybe he's still going to come back, but when that happens, it'll be at a completely later time. But yeah, those are everything associated with the mysterious disappearance of Granger Taylor, the man who apparently disappeared with a UFO. If anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about those of you in that area there called Duncan? If you know more info, if you were living around that time period and on a personal level knew Granger Taylor, I would love to hear what those comments are too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.